November 1873. The Blackwell Ironworks in Sheffield stands silent. The night shift arrives at 11:30 to find the casting floor cold, the forges banked, the crucibles empty, exactly as they left it 6 hours before. Then they see it. Furnace number 3 is glowing, not the dull ember of a dying fire, but white-hot, radiating heat you can feel from 30 feet away. The iron doors pulse with internal pressure. Heat shimmer rises in waves that distort the brick archways behind it. Orange light spills across the flagstones like liquid, pooling in every crack and corner. Thomas Harrow, the night foreman, stops walking. His hand drops from the lantern he's carrying. The coal bins beside number 3 are full, untouched. The loading doors are sealed. The dampers are closed. Nobody has fed this furnace since the day shift left at 5 o'clock. But it's burning. The crew stands in a loose semicircle, backlit by the furnace glow, their shadows stretching across the floor like prison bars. The only sound is the low, sustained roar from inside number 3, not the crackling of wood or the hiss of steam, something deeper, a resonance that vibrates through the iron frame of the building itself. One of the stokers, a man named Peter Gull, takes 3 steps toward the furnace and stops. He's worked iron for 20 years. He knows what heat sounds like, what it smells like, how it moves. This is different. The air around number 3 doesn't just shimmer, it pulses. The smell isn't coal smoke, it's sharper, chemical, wrong. Harrow orders everyone back. He approaches the observation port on the furnace's side, a small rectangular window protected by blackened glass. He leans in. The light from inside is so bright he has to squint. Through the glass, he can see the interior chamber glowing like the surface of the sun. The refractory bricks lining the walls are white, almost translucent with heat. And in the center, suspended in superheated air, flames twist and fold over themselves without any visible source. No coal, no coke, no fuel. Just fire. Harrow steps back. His face is slick with sweat. He looks at his crew and says the words that will echo through Sheffield's industrial quarter for months. It lit itself. The men don't move. The furnace continues to burn through the night, without being fed, without being stoked, without anyone understanding why. And in the morning, when the owner arrives and sees number 3 still blazing, still consuming nothing, he'll do what any rational man would do in 1873 when faced with the impossible. He'll call it a miracle, and then he'll try to replicate it. 6 months earlier, the Blackwell Ironworks was hemorrhaging money. Coal prices had doubled. Competition from Belgium and Germany was undercutting British foundries. The owner, Edmund Blackwell, made a decision that dozens of other ironmasters were making across England. If you can't afford more fuel, burn less of it. He hired an engineer named Vincent Aldrich. Aldrich had a reputation. He'd worked in the Midlands designing experimental blast furnaces that used heated air instead of raw draft, cutting fuel consumption by 1/3. He carried a leather notebook filled with sketches of airflow systems, heat recovery chambers, and chimney configurations that most furnace operators couldn't understand and didn't trust. At Blackwell, Aldrich proposed rebuilding furnace number 3 with a radical new design. Instead of a traditional straight chimney, he wanted a labyrinth system, a network of internal passages that would recirculate hot, exhaust gases back through the combustion chamber, preheating incoming air and extracting every possible calorie from the coal before it escaped up the stack. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it required precision that 1870s metallurgy couldn't guarantee. The rebuild took 3 months. Aldrich supervised every brick, every iron plate, every air duct. He designed the furnace with multiple chambers connected by narrow throats, each one intended to create a controlled vortex of heat. The refractory lining was thicker than standard. The doors were sealed with experimental gaskets made from compressed asbestos and iron filings. The damper system had 7 points of control instead of 3. The day they fired it up, it worked. Better than expected. Number 3 reached operating temperature using 40% less coal than the other furnaces. Blackwell was ecstatic. Aldrich was vindicated. But Thomas Harrow, the foreman, wasn't celebrating. He'd been watching the furnace during test runs. He noticed things. The way heat didn't dissipate evenly. How certain sections of the exterior stayed warm hours after banking. The strange whistling sound that came from the air ducts when the wind changed direction. Once, during a damper adjustment, he felt a sudden backdraft strong enough to rip the control rod from his hands. He reported it to Aldrich. The engineer dismissed it. Thermal inertia, he said. The design is holding heat longer. That's the point. Harrow wasn't convinced. He'd worked furnaces long enough to know the difference between retention and accumulation. Number 3 wasn't just holding heat, it was storing it. Somewhere in that maze of chambers and ducts, energy was building up with no clear way out. He tried explaining it to the workers. Most didn't care. A few listened. Peter Gull, the stoker who'd later witnessed the self-ignition, began paying attention to the furnace's behavior. He noticed that on humid days, condensation formed on the exterior brickwork in strange patterns. Irregular, asymmetric, like something inside was moving. Then came the sounds. It started 3 weeks before the incident. A low, rhythmic knocking from inside number 3's lower chamber, not constant, intermittent, sometimes once an hour, sometimes a dozen times in quick succession. The workers called it the furnace breathing. Aldrich checked the dampers, the air ducts, the refractory joints. Everything was structurally sound. He concluded it was expansion and contraction, normal operation. But the knocking got louder. And on the night of November 18th, when the day shift banked number 3 and sealed it for the night, Peter Gull stood by the furnace for an extra minute after everyone else had left. He put his hand on the exterior brickwork. It was warm, not unusual, but then he felt it. A vibration, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He pulled his hand away and walked out. He didn't report it. He wasn't even sure what he'd felt. But 6 hours later, when he returned for the night shift, furnace number 3 was burning without fuel, and the heartbeat had become a roar. The flame that burned without fuel wasn't magic. It was physics. Specifically, the kind of violent, uncontrolled physics that happens when you trap combustible gas in an enclosed space and give it an ignition source. Coal, even when it's sitting cold in a bin, releases gas. Methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide. In open air, these gases dissipate harmlessly. In a sealed furnace with thick refractory walls and minimal ventilation, they accumulate. Aldrich's design, with its network of interconnected chambers, created dozens of small pockets where gas could collect. The labyrinth system that was supposed to recirculate heat also trapped volatile compounds in dead zones where airflow stagnated. Over weeks of operation, these pockets grew. Not much. A few cubic feet here, a half-liter there. But in a furnace that retained heat for hours after banking, it was enough. On the evening of November 18th, when the day shift sealed number 3, they left behind an interior temperature of around 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Not hot enough to ignite gas on its own, but hot enough to sustain a slow thermal creep through the refractory bricks. Here's where the design became a trap. The refractory lining in number 3 was engineered to prevent heat loss. It did its job too well. Instead of radiating outward, heat remained contained within the furnace's core. The iron framework surrounding the brickwork absorbed this heat slowly, like a battery charging. By midnight, the exterior shell was warm. By 2 in the morning, it was hot. And then the wind changed. Sheffield in November is cold. The Blackwell Ironworks sat at the base of a valley where air currents funneled down from the moors. When the wind shifted northwest, it hit the factory's main chimney stack, creating a pressure differential that affected every furnace connected to the ventilation system. For most furnaces, this meant nothing. For number 3, with its maze of internal ducts, it created a reverse draft. Cold air rushed down through the chimney, hit the labyrinth system, and got pulled through the network of chambers. As it moved through the superheated interior, it expanded rapidly, creating a low-pressure zone behind it. This pulled more air through, faster. The system that was designed to recirculate exhaust became a bellows. The trapped pockets of coal gas began to move. As oxygen flooded the chambers, the gas mixed into combustible ratios. Methane and carbon monoxide that had been sitting inert suddenly had fuel, heat, and oxygen in the same space. The internal temperature, already elevated, climbed past 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it happened. Spontaneous ignition, not from a spark or flame, but from pure thermal energy. The first pocket ignited in the lower western chamber. The explosion was muffled by the thick refractory walls, but the pressure wave traveled through the duct system, compressing gas in adjacent chambers. Those ignited milliseconds later. Then the next. Then the next. Within 30 seconds, every trapped pocket of gas in furnace number 3 was burning. But here's what made it seem impossible. The fire wasn't consuming new fuel. It was burning residual gas that had accumulated over weeks. A slow-motion explosion spread across multiple chambers, each one contributing a small amount of combustible material to a sustained, self-feeding reaction. The labyrinth system, designed to extract maximum heat, now channeled burning gas through every passage. The airflow from the reverse draft fed oxygen continuously. The refractory lining trapped the heat, maintaining ignition temperature. The iron framework radiated heat back into the system, creating a feedback loop. Furnace number 3 had become a massive, unintentional gas engine. It didn't need coal because it was burning the ghost of coal. The vapor, the residue, the invisible byproduct of weeks of operation, all igniting at once in a perfectly timed cascade. By the time Thomas Harrow arrived, the furnace had been burning for 6 hours. It would continue for another 12 before the gas pockets finally depleted and the flames died. No fuel loaded, no stoker's hand, just chemistry, pressure, and a design that worked exactly as intended until it didn't. The morning after the furnace ignited itself, Edmund Blackwell ordered it sealed. Not banked, sealed. The loading doors were welded shut. The dampers were locked closed. The observation ports were covered with iron plates. For 3 days, number 3 was left to burn in isolation, while Blackwell and Aldrich argued behind closed doors about what to do next. The workers weren't arguing. They were terrified. By the second day, half the night shift refused to enter the building while number 3 was still glowing. Peter Gull told anyone who would listen that he'd felt the furnace, breathing, the night before it lit. Another stoker, James Corbin, claimed he'd heard sounds from inside the furnace during the incident. Not the roar of flames, something else. A high, thin whistle that rose and fell in pitch, almost like a voice. The day shift thought they were being dramatic, until the furnace door blew open. It happened on the 3rd morning. The interior pressure had been building as the gas burned through sealed chambers. The welds on the main loading door, hastily applied and not designed for sustained heat, failed. The door burst outward with a concussive blast that sent a wave of superheated air across the casting floor. 2 workers were 20 feet away. The heat flash burned exposed skin. One man's beard caught fire. The other stumbled backward into a stack of iron ingots and broke his wrist. The door hung open, bent on its hinges, revealing the furnace interior. It was still glowing white, still burning, still radiating heat that made it impossible to approach within 15 feet. And from the open doorway, a sound emerged that every witness would later describe differently. Gull said it was like wind through a cave. Corbin said it was mechanical, like gears grinding. Harrow said it reminded him of a locomotive building steam. One worker said it sounded like breathing. The Sheffield Gazette published a story 3 days later with the headline, "The Devil's Kiln, Furnace Burns Without Fuel at Blackwell Works." The article was sensational, inaccurate, and widely read. It claimed the furnace had been burning for a week, that workers had seen flames dancing without source, that the factory was cursed by the spirit of a man who died in a furnace accident 5 years prior. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Within a week, Blackwell Ironworks couldn't hire night shift workers. The day crew demanded hazard pay. 2 of the senior stokers quit outright. Aldrich, the engineer who designed number 3, stopped coming to the factory. He sent written reports analyzing the incident, blaming improper banking procedures and worker error. Harrow knew better. He'd been inside the factory when the door blew. He'd stood at the threshold of the furnace and looked into the white-hot interior. He'd seen the way flames moved through the chambers, not burning outward, but circulating inward, like a whirlpool. He'd felt the pressure waves pulsing from the open door in rhythmic intervals. He wrote his own report, unofficial, unpublished. He described the reverse draft, the trapped gas, the thermal feedback loop. He concluded that number 3's design was fundamentally unstable and recommended it be dismantled. Blackwell ignored the report. 2 weeks later, he ordered the furnace repaired and put back into service. He couldn't afford to lose the efficiency gains Aldrich's design had delivered. The modifications were minor: stronger door welds, additional dampers, a pressure relief valve on the main chamber. Number 3 reopened in December. It operated without incident for 4 months. And then, on a cold night in March 1874, it ignited itself again. This time, there were no workers inside. The night shift had been cancelled due to a coal delivery delay. When the day crew arrived at dawn, they found number 3 glowing, the pressure relief valve venting a steady stream of flame like a blowtorch, and the exterior brickwork cracked from thermal stress. Blackwell finally shut it down, permanently. The furnace was dismantled over the summer, the bricks salvaged, the iron framework sold for scrap. The labyrinth system was abandoned. Aldrich's design was never replicated. But the stories didn't stop. For years afterward, workers at Blackwell Ironworks claimed they could still hear sounds from the location where number 3 had stood. A faint knocking, a distant roar, the ghost of a furnace that had burned without fuel and refused to go cold. In 1923, 50 years after the incident, a metallurgical engineer named Dr. Harold Penrose came across a mention of the Blackwell Ironworks case in an obscure industrial journal. He was researching early blast furnace failures for a textbook on refractory design, and something about the description caught his attention. A furnace that burned without fuel, a labyrinth ventilation system, spontaneous ignition after banking. He tracked down the original reports, Harrow's unofficial account, Aldrich's defensive technical notes, eyewitness testimony from the Sheffield Gazette, and most importantly, he found surviving pieces of the furnace. A section of the labyrinth ductwork had been preserved by a scrap dealer who thought the unusual design might be valuable someday. It sat in a warehouse in Manchester, rusted and partially collapsed, but intact enough for analysis. Penrose examined it for 3 months. What he found confirmed everything Harrow had suspected and Aldrich had refused to acknowledge. The labyrinth system wasn't just inefficient, it was a trap. The network of chambers and narrow passages created multiple dead zones where gas could accumulate without ventilation. The refractory lining was too effective, retaining heat long after the furnace was banked. And critically, the chimney connection created a perfect pathway for reverse drafts. But Penrose found something else, something nobody in 1873 could have detected. The iron framework surrounding the furnace had been cast from recycled scrap, standard practice, cheaper than new iron, but the scrap contained trace amounts of sulfur and phosphorus, impurities that lowered the metal's melting point and increased its heat retention capacity. The framework didn't just absorb heat, it stored it, releasing it slowly over hours. In effect, the furnace had a thermal battery built into its structure. Every time it was fired, heat soaked into the iron framework. Every time it was banked, that heat remained, keeping the refractory lining warm. Over weeks of operation, the baseline temperature of the furnace never truly dropped. It just accumulated. By November 1873, when number 3 was supposedly cold, its interior was probably still above 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Add trapped coal gas, a reverse draft, and a spark of thermal ignition, and you had exactly what Harrow witnessed, a furnace that burned without being fed. Penrose published his findings in 1925. The paper was technical, dry, and read by almost nobody outside academic metallurgy circles. But it settled the question definitively. Furnace number 3 hadn't defied physics. It had obeyed physics so precisely, in such an unexpected combination, that it seemed impossible. The Devil's Kiln wasn't supernatural. It was a design flaw executed with perfect timing. Penrose ended his paper with a note that resonates beyond the specific case of Blackwell Ironworks. He wrote, "The history of industrial innovation is inseparable from the history of industrial failure. Every advance in efficiency, every attempt to extract more from less, pushes systems closer to the edge of control. We learn not from our successes, but from the moments when success and catastrophe become indistinguishable." Furnace number 3 was one of those moments. It worked, it was efficient, it saved money, and then it ignited itself, not because someone made a mistake, but because the design was too clever for its own stability. The Industrial Revolution was built on experiments like this. Hundreds of furnaces, engines, boilers, and machines pushed past safe limits by people trying to solve practical problems with insufficient knowledge. Most of the time, they failed safely. Occasionally, they failed spectacularly. And sometimes, very rarely, they succeeded so well that they became dangerous. The Blackwell Ironworks closed in 1891, a victim of cheaper steel and foreign competition. The building was demolished in 1910. The land is now a parking lot in Sheffield's industrial quarter. There's no monument, no historical marker. But if you dig through the archives of metallurgical engineering, you'll find references to the Blackwell effect, the phenomenon of trapped gas ignition in poorly ventilated furnaces with high thermal retention. It's named after the furnace that burned without fuel, the furnace that worked exactly as designed until it didn't, the furnace that taught an entire generation of engineers that efficiency without understanding is just a slower route to disaster. Furnace number 3, the Devil's Kiln, the impossible flame. Not a miracle, not a curse. Just iron, heat, and chemistry, combined in ways nobody expected until it was too late to stop.